With more exposure to problems with sexual harassment, especially in the workplace, there's also more attention these days to the role played by the Mass Commission Against Discrimination. Its mission is to eradicate discrimination through investigation and prosecution, but also through prevention. To explain how that works is the Chairwoman of the Commission, Suni Thomas George. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
I want to start with just the way things are going on with the whole climate of Me Too these days. Has your agency been getting more attention in some way around this?
We certainly have. As you know, being the MCAD, the Mass Commission Against Discrimination, we enforce the anti-discrimination laws, which include those laws against sexual harassment. And so we are definitely seeing a rise of inquiries and requests for trainings that have come in. We know that eventually in the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to see more cases that have come in from people who believe that they were victims of sexual harassment.
Well, explain what your agency can do, because you're not exactly a criminal investigative body, but on the other hand, you're not just a neutral fact finder either. So what exactly are you in this?
Well, we're an administrative agency. We basically take any complaints that have to do with the discrimination cases, whether it's based on race or gender, sex, national origin, disability, those kind of protected classes, and we investigate. And during our investigation period, we are neutrals. We look at the claims that come in, we serve those complaints to the respondent or the employer or the landlord, and we do a full investigation to see whether or not there was discrimination. Once we find probable cause, you're right, we become prosecutors in the case, and then we adjudicate those cases. We also do mediations, conciliations, trainings. So we're a good body, and part of our mission is to eradicate discrimination through education and outreach and training.
And of course, in cases where you find there's really something wrong that happened, somebody can be assessed a penalty, and then they can appeal too, right?
Absolutely. They can go all the way to a public hearing. And then a hearing officer will assess the case and decide whether or not which side prevails in the case. If the complainant, the person who brought the sexual harassment charge, prevails, they can assess anything from back pay, front pay, emotional distress, different types of affirmative relief, like they can ask the respondent, the employer, to redo their policies, to provide trainings to their managers or supervisors. So there's a lot that the commission can do in terms of damages.
Well, the term sexual harassment is used so much, it can get kind of imprecise. You're dealing with cases that involve discrimination, so how does harassment become discriminatory?
Well, it's part of our anti-discrimination laws here in the Commonwealth, Mass General Laws, Chapter 151B, which say you can't discriminate, nor can you sexually harass. That is a legal term of art. It's more than just inappropriate conduct. It's conduct that rises to the level of sexual harassment. So, for example, it's sexual in nature, it's severe, pervasive, and becomes humiliating or offending to the person. And usually it affects the person's ability to do their job. So there is a legal standard to being able to prove that someone was sexually harassed.
I guess one of the factors you have to look for is whether that behavior is connected with a quid pro quo. In other words, if you don't allow this, maybe you will lose your job or something like that.
We definitely see cases of quid pro quo. The most common case we see is hostile work environment, where gender becomes part of the claim of that they are being subjected to a hostile work environment. But the other claim, as you said, are the quid pro quos, the this for that. So people can keep their job as long as they're doing something in return, or people will only get a promotion if they're allowing their boss or their coworker to continue to sexually harass them.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Suni Thomas George from the Mass Commission Against Discrimination. I want to ask you about one of the things that must be tough for your agency as well as for people involved in this, is that if you feel you've been experiencing sexual harassment, it's probably happened when other people aren't around or they can't hear what's being said. So, how do you maintain credibility around a complaint?
Most of these cases do come down to credibility. A lot of our cases regarding sexual harassment are he said, she said. But for most people, there's usually, although credibility plays a role, there's usually some kind of additional evidence. Nowadays, there's texts, emails, there may be even gifts given, and there's usually someone who has witnessed it or someone else who has worked in the company or in the place of employment that has also been subjected to this type of inappropriate behavior.
I noticed that one advice your agency gives out around filing a complaint is to log what happened so that later on, you can say, this is what happened on this day. Explain the importance of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always important to document what happens, but it's also important to remember dates, remember who was around, the time it happened, and we have all this, like you said, on our website that people can go to and look at this information. It is hard to prove sexual harassment cases, especially if there's no witnesses. But what we do make sure that people know their rights, and people, before they even bring a claim, can look at our website to determine what they need to prove a claim of discrimination, especially when it comes to sexual harassment.
What's it like when your agency has to investigate a complaint? Because I imagine that takes some time, some resources.
It does take a lot of resources. Chris, we have about 10% of our cases are sexual harassment cases, not just sex discrimination or discrimination on other sex stereotypes, but 10% of them are sexual harassment cases. And these types of cases normally result in a probable cause finding, which means they continue throughout the MCAD with prosecution and adjudication. You can imagine that sometimes it can take more than a year, sometimes a few years, to get a case all the way to a public hearing and through an appeals process. It takes resources. We need resources, and we've been asking the legislature for additional resources in terms of trainers and mediators to help combat this epidemic that's been happening.
Now, of course, there is an overlap in what you're forcing against here and what's going on around immigration. A lot of these reports we're hearing about involve immigrants who've been harassed, and some of the immigrants are very concerned about their legal status. What should they be thinking if they're going to approach MCAD?
Well, the MCAD makes no distinction between residency or citizenship status. So if anybody in any type of position anywhere, whether you're the most common type of case we see, which is service industry, basically women who are in low wage positions, should still come to the MCAD. You don't always have to file a complaint. You can come in and have a consult with us, and we're happy to provide you information.
Now, I know there is some possibility of doing something remotely through mail or by email even, but talk about the advantage of coming in there in person to file a complaint.
It's important to come in. We have 4 offices, our principal office is in Boston. We have offices all across the Commonwealth in Worcester, Springfield, New Bedford. When you come in and you sit with a person, an intake person who has been doing investigations, who has experience at the MCAD, you'll get a better understanding of what facts are important and what your complaint should look like. Because allegations can go in all different directions. And the advantage of having to be able to come in and sit with an intake worker is being able to really have a focused complaint, so that when we serve it to the other side, the answer, the position statement that comes in is also focused on what the response is. So a lot of people mostly come in and meet with an intake officer and consult with us. It also gives you an idea of whether or not your claim rises to the level of sexual harassment. And if it doesn't, what are your other options out there?
I want to ask you about another option. The most obvious one maybe is that if somebody's having a problem at a workplace, shouldn't they be able to have that addressed internally and not even have to go to MCAD?
Well, we're hoping with some of the training that we do and others do that employers and businesses understand that it starts with having a good policy in place that talks about what to do if you think you've been exposed to inappropriate conduct or you've been sexually harassed. Who to go to? What are your next steps? What are your options out there? So it's important to have a good policy and be able to go to a human resources officer or a person in a position that can address these concerns. The second part is if you are getting a complaint and allegations of sexual harassment or inappropriate conduct, that employers and businesses are taking the next step, which is to thoroughly investigate it. And employers should also note that when they're investigating complaints of sexual harassment, that they should not look at the victim or the person who came forward and take adverse action against them by moving them or putting them on a paid leave while the investigation is happening. They should realize that the person has come forward. It takes a lot of courage to come forward, and they should make sure that they're treating that person respectfully as well.
And I imagine, too, that a complaint should reflect on what can be done internally and maybe what isn't being done, too, right?
Yes, it absolutely can. For most employers, sometimes what happens is it becomes a bigger problem when conduct starts as very low-level, inappropriate conduct, but because it doesn't get addressed appropriately and in a timely way, it rises to the level of sexual harassment so that the behavior or the conduct becomes more severe and pervasive over time.
We should finally mention, if people want more information or even find out how to file a complaint, what's the best way to pursue that?
They can definitely go to our website. You can Google Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. You can always call us at 617-994-6000.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chris.
Suni Thomas George from the Mass Commission Against Discrimination.